Spain, July 1936. The coup d'etat, led by Francisco Franco, sought to overthrow the democratically elected Second Republic. Thus began the dream and the ordeal of these young people whose faith led them to a distance in an unknown land.
A call went out for pilot trainees. I thought, why not? I'll apply. I thought without much hope, but they accepted me.
Politically, I belonged to the Republican left. We believed that the Republic could put down the uprising. Then the advancing troops arrived, and things became serious. It was already clear that this would be a long war, and people said, well, this has to be solved somehow.
The Republic needed a large number of pilots in a very short period of time. Its flight schools were operating at full capacity. Most instructors were already at the front. As a result, there simply weren't enough instructors.
Republican Spain turned to France for assistance. France offered only basic training. They then appealed to Great Britain, but Britain categorically refused. They were left with no other alternative.
I immediately volunteered to go. I loved aviation, and nobody could persuade me otherwise. Not my family, not anyone.
I found him in the subway and asked him where he was going. He said, I'm going to become a pilot. What do you mean, become a pilot? Yes, on the Castellana Street. If you're between 18 and 21 years old, you can apply for aviation training. Really? I took the address he gave me and ran off to sign up.
To meet the age requirement, I added a year to my real age because otherwise I wouldn't have qualified. Back then, they didn't check such things very carefully. I took the theory exams and passed them right away.
There was also a general knowledge exam. At that time, illiteracy was still widespread, so they mainly wanted to know whether applicants could read and write. My father, for example, had only completed primary school, reading, writing, basic arithmetic, and not much more.
There were university students among them, but what really determined admission was the medical examination.
They eliminated candidates in large numbers. Out of about 50 of us, only 12 or 13 remained.
Because of a minor eyesight defect, I wasn't accepted. So I said, fine, then I'll become a mechanic.
We attended theory classes and practiced flight procedures using mock controls at the Sabadell airfield, but there were no airplanes available for actual flying. Then an opportunity arose to complete the course in France. I was selected, which was unusual because only 30 people were chosen. But later, we were informed that we would not be going to France after all. We would go directly to the Soviet Union for training.
This was the result of actions carried out by Soviet Russia and the USSR under the slogan, "Workers of the World, Unite." They also hoped to implement such a project in Spain. The Soviet Union provided both military and financial assistance, particularly fuel. 80% of the fuel used in Spain came from Baku. Military aid included aircraft, tanks, and weapons.
For the first group, $1,011,697 US were paid for the training of 198 students. It was expensive. Why? Because the cost was not just the training itself, but also the entire logistical operation of transporting people from Spain to the Caucasus.
The Republic faced enormous difficulties sending them across a Europe that was neither friendly to the Soviet Union nor under its influence.
They were strictly forbidden from getting off the train at stations or interacting with anyone. The authorities didn't want people asking, where are all these young Spaniards going?
The Maria Ulianova arrived, an old but beautiful ship. They treated us like kings. Some people gained as much as 6 kilograms during the 8-day voyage. We arrived in Leningrad. From there, we traveled toward Moscow, then Kharkov, then south to Odessa, and finally to Kirovabad.
We traveled past Corsica and Sardinia, then through the Strait of Messina along the Italian coast. For us, it was wonderful. I will never forget that journey. We passed through Greece, but they didn't allow us to disembark because we were traveling on a regular civilian vessel.
The trip took 3 days and 4 nights. We discovered that the aviation school was not really an aviation school at all. We had imagined a fully equipped institution designed for flight training. Instead, everything had been improvised.
Classes began on February 1st, 1937, with 193 students entering the program. The Spanish Republic itself paid the Soviet Union 3.5 million rubles for the creation of this military school. As a result of this payment, the pilot training school was established in Azerbaijan in the city of Ganja.
The non-intervention committees and similar organizations might have asked, why is there a list of Spanish names at a flight school in the Soviet Union if nobody is supposed to be helping anyone? So they gave them Russian names. Then nobody would know anything. If anyone asked, they were simply another 200 Soviet students. This is my father, Vicente Montejano, at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. Around 17 or 18 years old. In Kirovabad, he was probably already 20, wearing his pilot's uniform.
The Soviet Air Force showed remarkable foresight by choosing training fields very similar to those in Spain's Levante region. The terrain is dry in winter, while summers bring extreme continental temperatures, very hot summers and cold winters.
Each barracks had 10 or 12 beds. The dining hall prepared meals according to our tastes. All in all, they treated us very well.
There were as many as 6 different airfields. The first thing the pilots had to do was clear the stones from them, piling the rocks into heaps because the runways were nothing but stony ground.
As soon as they arrived, they were told, you will no longer be called Vicente Montejano or Montejano Vicente, as is common in many Eastern European countries. From now on, your name will be Marskoy Vicenti.
Some of them had already fought on the ground during the Spanish Civil War, which almost guaranteed that they were sympathetic to Soviet ideology at the time. Of course, many concealed their true political beliefs. When asked whether they were communists or sympathizers of the Communist Party, they simply said, yes. Later, it became clear that some of them were not communists at all, not even socialists.
There were Republicans, liberals, and even some anarchists. I remember the case of a former aviator who was a Marxist-Leninist and got himself into serious trouble because, during a political theory class, he rejected Stalinist Marxism.
They attended political lectures given by Commissar Mirov, the head of the school. He subjected them to what they considered genuine torture, hour-long talks about politics. On top of the language barrier, they understood very little of what he was actually saying.
As in any wartime situation, there were always political maneuvers behind the scenes. In the second class of trainees, 2 individuals with serious psychiatric problems managed to get through the selection process. There were also 2 deserters. Naturally, those deserters quickly informed Franco's government that Spanish pilots were being trained in the Soviet Union.
In the afternoons, they attended theory classes, while early in the morning they were taken out to fly from those stone-covered airfields.
The first group eventually had to put their foot down because they realized that the Soviet instructors were unable to communicate with them. What they did next was pedagogically remarkable. First, students practiced maneuvers on the ground using scale models. You are going to do this now. You will fly here, turn here, go there, and then return. Then Clara Rosen and Cascon compiled a Russian-Spanish aviation dictionary.
They developed a set of key words, a basic vocabulary of perhaps 20 essential terms.
The interpreters had an enormous and exhausting task. They had to climb onto the wing of the aircraft and explain to the pilot exactly what he had to do. Raise the wing slightly, increase the engine revolutions to this level, and so on.
They wore headsets connected by rubber tubes. The instructor sat in front and the student behind, or perhaps the other way around, but they communicated through those primitive headsets.
Una formación que normalmente duraba 2 años.
A training program that would normally have lasted 2 years was compressed into periods of approximately 6 months. Other air forces, such as the Luftwaffe, considered 150 flying hours the minimum. The RAF and the United States Army Air Forces were training pilots with around 300 hours. The Kirovabad trainees who flew the most accumulated only about 100 hours.
After flying, you went back to the barracks, built from the wooden crates used to transport aircraft, and attended classes. Non-stop, again and again.
Spanish pilots in Kirovabad trained on the Polikarpov U-2, a very simple aircraft and relatively easy to fly.
As you can see, it is all wires, wood and fabric, designed to be as light as possible because engines at the time did not yet have sufficient power. For a 17 or 18-year-old with no previous aviation training, in a foreign country and unable to speak the language, the experience must have been shocking, perhaps even traumatic. It is a very large aircraft for a trainer, bulky, slow and imposing.
Our pilots affectionately call it the 100 machine. It has a 100 horsepower engine, takes off at 100 kilometers per hour, cruises at 100, and lands at 100. It simply doesn't do much more than that.
What surprises you is the simplicity of everything. Not necessarily the reliability, it works well enough, but the simplicity. Take this latch, for example, on the engine cowling. It is just a spring that locks into place. Pure Russian engineering, maximum simplicity. The engine is started using compressed air bottles. When the pilot presses the starter, you position the propeller correctly. If you get the position right, the engine starts on the first attempt. If not, you try again until you find the correct position.
And that is exactly how you're working in this day?
Exactly. Nothing has changed. This is the fuel measuring stick for the Po-2. You remove the cap, take out the filter, and check the level. About 90 liters.
There is no door. You have to climb onto the wing and squeeze yourself into the cockpit. What we now call ergonomics simply did not exist. It was an aircraft designed to be easy to manufacture and easy to maintain. The pilot's comfort was not a consideration.
It does not even have a tail wheel. Instead, there is a skid, a piece of metal that drags along the ground. That is its only braking system. In fact, it has no brakes at all. The pedals are just pedals. They do not operate brakes. The wheels roll freely.
It was designed for the kind of airfields available at the time, dirt strips or grass fields when grass was available. Takeoffs were always made into the wind.
At first, they taxied the aircraft around the field at high speed until they became accustomed to handling it on the ground and learned how to keep it from nosing over.
One of my father's friends saw another pilot stall the aircraft. He always used to tell the story. I was shouting from the rear cockpit, even though I knew he couldn't hear me. I kept yelling, "Kuro, push the stick forward. Kuro, push the stick forward." But Kuro never did. Then he would add, and there he was, left like a little monkey all burned.
One day, a very strong windstorm came up. They were trying to handle the aircraft as they were landing. What you had to do was hold onto the wings so that the pilot could get out. In this case, they couldn't manage it. The aircraft reared up onto its tail, and the propeller sliced through a trainee's legs.
We never actually saw the city of Kirovabad. We had no permission to leave the base. We were there incognito. We only saw it from the air. It looked like a very large town because it spread out over a wide area. You could see farmland and herds of livestock.
Some of them got up to the usual youthful mischief. They would sneak out at night because they had arranged to meet a girl and wanted to see her naturally.
Sometimes the instructors' wives would come to do shooting practice. We would go there just to watch. They would lie on the ground all wriggling around like frogs. And you can imagine us, right? We had a great time. And there was always a queue outside. Everyone would be saying, "It's not your turn. You were here yesterday."
For the Soviets, secrecy was extremely important. They did not want anyone to know that Spanish pilots were being trained there. But that was practically impossible. They were Spaniards. To get from the classrooms to the dining hall, they had to cross public streets and inevitably encountered local people. They had been told to stay quiet and not let anyone hear them speaking Spanish, but it was hopeless. If they saw a girl, they would flirt with her. They talked to everyone. The presence of Spaniards there quickly became an open secret.
When they were passing through the French consulate and having their documents stamped, an official asked Bravo, "Profession?" He replied, "Diver." The official then asked, "And at what altitude do you fly as a diver?"
The people were wonderful, the instructors especially. The best thing about the whole experience.
The Russian pilots assigned to train them were exceptional. They managed to turn young men who had never even sat in an airplane into fully qualified fighter pilots in the space of 6 months.
I trained alongside the aces of Soviet aviation. They were known as the Golden Horde, heroes, twice decorated heroes. I was there with them.
We progressed through different aircraft. First the U-2, then an aircraft with a 500 horsepower engine, something much more serious. After that, we moved on to the different operational specialties.
You trained on the U-2, and from there you moved on to the Katyuska, the Tupolev SB-2. And if you were really like a hunting dog, then you went to the I-16.
This aircraft had 1,700 horsepower in total, 860 horsepower per engine. The pilots sat here. Back here was the gunner, defending the aircraft against fighters. And here sat the observer. Gil de Rola sat here, Fernando Goitia here, and I was here.
The assignment often depended on your temperament. If they considered you calm and steady, they would send you to bombers. If they saw you as more aggressive, more daring, then fighters. The I-15, despite being an outdated aircraft with fixed landing gear, an open cockpit, and a biplane design, was greatly feared by the pilots of the Condor Legion. I can say this based on documentary sources. It could turn tightly within a patch of sky and unleash, so to speak, a burst from 4 machine guns that would tear you apart. You might hit one of its cylinders, but the rest would keep running. On the other hand, if you hit the cooling system of a Messerschmitt, it would immediately go down. And so the Messerschmitt pilots learned, watch out for the Chatos, watch out.
What happened during the 1930s? That was when the great race for fighter speed began. The design solution for achieving higher fighter speeds and intercepting bombers before they reached their targets was to build monoplanes with high wing loading. In other words, aircraft with a single wing, excellent maneuverability, and very low drag, allowing them to achieve much higher speeds with engines of similar power. The first nation to produce a viable fighter of this type was the Soviet Union, with the I-16 several years ahead of Germany and Britain. The arrival of the Polikarpov-Yermin 16 during the Spanish Civil War represented such a significant advance that the Republic achieved air superiority over Madrid.
When this aircraft arrived in Spain in October 1936 through the port of Cartagena, it came in shipping crates marked with the word Moskova in Cyrillic letters. People shortened it to Mosca. It entered combat for the first time over the Madrid front in November 1936. Until then, nationalist aircrews attacking Madrid received an unpleasant surprise, an aircraft that attacked them from below at tremendous speed. The few pilots who survived reported being attacked by airplanes that seemed to emerge from the sewers. Between that and the fact that the aircraft was painted gray, later changed to green, the nickname Rat was born among its enemies.
You know how much someone can love a doll, right? The I-16 Mosca was like a doll.
We flew at 6,000 meters without oxygen equipment. Some pilots would lose consciousness and fall. If there were no mountains beneath them, they often regained consciousness at around 1,500 meters and simply continued flying.
With the I-16, you could raise the nose without adding power. It would lose speed, and suddenly, it would enter a spin. If you simply let go of the controls, hands and feet off everything, it would recover by itself like a gentleman.
They bought an American engine in Spain, a Wright Cyclone with tremendous power, and installed it in the Mosca. We then formed a high-altitude Moscow squadron known as the Pacifier Squadron, the 4th Squadron.
I was truly frightened only once. The landing gear had to be retracted manually because it was entirely mechanical. Somehow I became distracted and forgot about it. As I approached to land, I had already calculated my height. With the Mosca, you only had about 30 centimeters of margin. Any higher and a wing tip could strike the ground. I was already at landing height and couldn't hear the wheels touching down. Then I realized, the landing gear! There was no time to extend it. I had to go around. The shock made me slam the throttle forward too abruptly, and the engine started coughing and sputtering. I broke into a cold sweat. Eventually, everything worked out, and I landed safely. But that was real fear. Genuine fear.
The choice of aircraft depended not only on your flying ability, but sometimes on your political background as well. Sacristan once told me that his instructor believed he belonged in fighter aviation because he had exceptional aptitude. However, Sacristan's father, a landowner from Getafe, had been executed during the first days of the war. When Soviet authorities learned this, they said, "No, you can't go into fighters." Why not? Later, back in Spain, they explained it to him. If you wanted revenge for what happened to your father, who's to say you wouldn't defect to the other side with a fighter aircraft?
They let us try the I-16 Type 33, which had almost twice the engine power of the earlier version. It had 4 synchronized machine guns. 4. Just pull the trigger and 20 rounds would come out instantly.
At first, these aircraft were flown by Soviet pilots. Shortly afterward, they were gradually replaced by Spanish pilots who had completed their training in the Soviet Union.
In the first group, 2 or 3 trainees were killed, including instructors. The same happened in the second group and in the third. Altogether, there were perhaps 15 or 20 fatal accidents.
I must admit that the Soviet people treated us Spaniards like their own children, or even better. When their bread ration was 600 grams, they gave us 800 grams.
When the Spanish pilots left for combat duty, the Soviets cried. Why? Because they knew those young men were heading toward the worst possible fate, toward death. They always told them, be careful, be very careful, watch your altitude. Because they were about to face the very best pilots of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, and they wept when saying goodbye.
You don't feel fear to begin with. You're a fighter pilot, and you're going to carry out your mission.
The head of the training schools told me, remember this, we are not fighting in defense of a political party. We are fighting in defense of the Constitution. I've never forgotten those words. They shaped my view of life and taught me that a person has a duty to uphold the law.
Each graduating class was divided into separate groups starting, if I remember correctly, with the second intake. The first class left on January 3rd and returned in time for the Battle of Brunette in July. They were given 15 days of leave to spend with their families. In reality, however, the burden of the air war was carried primarily by the first and second classes.
To take those young men, send them back to Spain and have them not all die on their first combat flight, that was a remarkable achievement.
The pilots trained in the Soviet Union had direct access to the very aircraft that would later be used in Spain. These aircraft were being supplied by the Soviet Union and represented the most advanced equipment available to the Republican Air Force. As a result, those pilots had air supremacy.
I believe I set either the European or world altitude record for an open cockpit aircraft by reaching 11,500 meters in the Mosca. At that point, we finally achieved altitude superiority over the Germans. They were no longer always above us. We were above them. Our problem was that we flew at very high altitudes while they carried out bombing attacks at low altitude. We were flying at 6,000 meters while they continued bombing below us. That was a failure of command.
Thanks to that effort, the Republic managed to hold out not for 1 year, but for almost 3.
At first, you don't see the enemy aircraft. I think that happened to all of us. You are assigned a flight leader, and suddenly you see him making turns and half rolls. You follow him, but you only watch your leader. You have no idea what's happening around you. Then someone asks, "Why were you making so many turns?" "What turns? Didn't you see the enemy?" "What enemy? There was enemy aircraft. There were 40 of them. How could there be 40? I didn't see a single one." Well, 40 pilots could have killed you because you weren't paying attention.
The aircraft scatter and a melee develops. A swirling mass of airplanes climbing, diving, and turning. That's aerial combat. That's what a dogfight really looks like.
The German Messerschmitt Bf 109 always avoided combat with the I-16. We could immediately maneuver and get onto its tail. You could perform surprise attacks. The Immelmann, the barrel roll. Everything came naturally in that aircraft. It was astonishingly easy to fly.
We carried out all kinds of missions, reconnaissance flights, bombing attacks, many operations launched from Barcelona.
We would be at about 8,000 meters altitude and could carry out the bombing run in a dive.
That small folder you see there contains aircraft recognition cards. Pilots had to memorize them thoroughly. Usually you spotted aircraft from a distance, so the sooner you could identify the model and determine whether it was friend or foe, the better. You had to know them by heart.
My name is Ludmila Bravo. I am the daughter of José María Bravo Fernández Hermosa. My father was one of the aces of Republican aviation. I grew up listening to what I used to call his war stories, the stories he told his friends.
The aircraft could fail you. It could break down. The engine could fail. You could crash. But we didn't think about those things. We thought about accomplishing the mission and shooting down as many enemy aircraft as possible without being shot down ourselves.
When I was little, I often asked him, "But Dad, did you kill people?"
We had nothing against the men who were flying those aircraft. We were aviators, and our job was to shoot down airplanes. The Germans had a habit of killing pilots who bailed out by parachute because they believed it took much longer to train a pilot than to build an aircraft. Spanish pilots never attacked airmen descending by parachute.
He had tremendous charisma and natural leadership qualities, like the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Some people play a flute and everyone follows them. That was my father.
I was always very aggressive in combat, and so was my squadron. We attacked however we could. Bombers rarely escaped us. According to historians, I shot down 23 aircraft. I don't say that, they do. Of those 23, perhaps 8 or 9 were bombers. The rest were fighters. Fighters weren't really the greatest danger. The real threat to people on the ground came from bombers. Attack, then fight as best you can. Protect your comrades. Never find yourself alone. Never abandon your own people.
Those of us left on foot simply headed for the border. I believe I arrived around the 7th. It took us 14 or 15 hours to reach France. And the French received us very badly and gradually directed us toward a concentration camp they had established at Argelès-sur-Mer. The Republican aviators still in Spain left the country, and some eventually went into exile in the Soviet Union.
On February 6, 1939, at WWII airfield in Girona, one of the last airfields still held by the Republic, they were preparing to fly the remaining aircraft across the Pyrenees and hand them over to France. While warming up the engines, Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters from the Condor Legion appeared and began strafing the field. Your father was sitting inside his aircraft with the engine running. Another airplane was blocking his path, making it impossible to move. Then he saw a fighter approaching from the side, firing directly at him. In a fraction of a second, driven by instinct and extraordinary reflexes, he climbed onto his seat, leapt onto the engine cowling, and then somersaulted over the spinning propeller. He landed on the other side just as bullets tore his aircraft apart. A mechanic pulled him away from the wreckage and said, "I don't know how you're still alive."
This is my father, a member of the 4th graduating class from Kirovabad. The entire 4th class was caught by the end of the war. The school closed and nobody knew what to do with them. The Spanish state had paid for their training, but suddenly there was no republic left to return to.
We never imagined we would remain abroad for so long. We believed a world war was approaching and that once it began, we would return to Spain. But it didn't happen that way.
The Soviet Union was not interested in having these people travel around the world. Therefore, it proposed that they collaborate and become part of the Soviet Union.
Among the young men, there was a division. Some said, "I'm going back to Spain. I'm going back." Others accepted that they would have to remain in the Soviet Union.
2 years after the end of the Spanish Civil War, many former students had joined either the Red Army or Soviet society. Those who remained were viewed with suspicion. The Soviet attitude became, if you're not with us, you're against us. For 2 years they had been saying, "We want to leave the Soviet Union. We want to go home." They were told, "If you return to Spain, Franco will execute you." "Fine," they replied. "Then let us go to France, Argentina, Mexico, anywhere."
Of the pilots who completed military training in 1939, 185 were unable to return to Spain because General Francisco Franco had by then established a dictatorship. As a result, these 185 pilots were forced to remain abroad. 84 eventually moved to Mexico, while 101 remained in Azerbaijan.
When the Second World War began, their circumstances changed dramatically. One of their main goals had been to serve as pilots in Soviet aviation. That did not happen immediately.
Apparently, Stalin was not pleased with the idea. He had already experienced cases where pilots escaped to other countries with aircraft. He simply did not trust them. His conclusion was, no, they will not serve as aviators.
Many sought ways to escape to the free countries of Europe. One group even attempted to leave through an American embassy as diplomatic cargo, hidden inside crates. The crates had air holes drilled into them. But once the aircraft was airborne, one of them began to suffocate and started pounding on the box. The plane landed, and he was sent to a camp in Siberia.
Then from June 1941 until March 1954, many of them passed through labour camps, prisons, and every kind of detention facility imaginable.
My father served in artillery units involved with naval mines somewhere near the Sea of Azov. The waters were freezing. Despite being very athletic, he suffered terribly from the cold. They were hungry as well.
He was held in various camps. Temperatures reached 40 degrees below zero, and conditions like that. While there, he nearly lost his entire right hand through self-amputation. Some camps housed what he called undesirable elements. Others were shared with prisoners of war. I think he spent about 5 years there.
In my father's case, he was assigned, of course, to sabotage operations. He became a saboteur, like so many other Spaniards.
Yes, that's what I did there. I carried out demolitions. I blew up 3 German trains. All 3 were carrying personnel. And it wasn't easy, believe me, planting a mine on a railway track. The first time I did it, I wasn't just afraid. That doesn't even begin to describe it. I was terrified. Then it exploded with a tremendous blast and caused heavy casualties. I gained a kilo without eating a thing. That's how happy I was after blowing up my first train.
He shared quarters with 18 or 20 of his comrades. They came into contact with members of the Blue Division, poor sailors who had been taken prisoner and happened to be in Odessa when the war ended. The Soviet authorities basically told them, "You know what? This ship will serve as payment for what the Spanish Republic owes us, and you are going to stay here with us. And so, through no fault of their own, these men ended up in concentration camps.
They were carrying out an experiment unlike anything ever attempted in military aviation. During the first months of the war, the Soviets had captured several German aircraft. The question was, who in all of Europe knew enough about German airplanes to fly them? The Spaniards. So they sent 18 Spaniards to a location in the Urals and had them begin flying captured German aircraft, complete with German markings, with the idea of infiltrating enemy airspace and shooting down German planes. The project never went ahead. It was simply too complicated. For example, radio communications. Imagine calling out 1, 2, 3 when the pilot couldn't even count in German.
During the Second World War, they defended the airspace and airfields of Belarus, the Caucasus region, Moscow, Odessa, and Baku.
Bravo served in a unit responsible for protecting all the oil fields around Baku. They had to prevent German reconnaissance aircraft from photographing the area and discovering what lay beneath. They flew patrols lasting 2 or 3 hours whenever possible. Not a single enemy aircraft got through. Well, a few tried, and they were shot down.
Why was Baku's oil so important to Adolf Hitler? Because Baku's oil was considered a decisive factor in achieving global domination. The wars of that era were wars of engine.
During one nighttime reconnaissance mission, he was running out of fuel. He landed in the dark and could barely see. His radio had also failed. After landing, he went to sleep beneath the aircraft. When he woke up the next morning, he discovered he had landed in the middle of an oil field, which was heavily protected and effectively mined. There was no way to take off. They had to dismantle the aircraft in order to remove it from the oil field.
Of the 22 million tons of fuel produced, 4.9 million tons were high-octane aviation gasoline, allowing Soviet aircraft to climb 3,000 meters higher than German Messerschmitt fighters. During those years, Germany produced only about 5 million tons of oil in total. The oil produced in Azerbaijan was of such high quality that it could be sent continuously to the front, while Germany often had to wait months before delivering fuel to its soldiers and military units. That is a historical fact.
When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and a large part of the Soviet Air Force was destroyed on the ground, they armed these aircraft and transformed them from trainers into light bombers.
It was an aircraft made entirely of wood and fabric. A single incendiary bullet could turn it into a flying torch. But compared to other aircraft, it was very quiet, flew slowly, and skimmed just above the treetops, allowing it to reach German positions undetected.
They fitted bomb racks beneath the wings and mounted a defensive machine gun in the rear cockpit. Their solution was to fly exclusively at night.
The navigator sitting in the rear cockpit would occasionally switch on a small flashlight for just a second or two to check the map and compare it with visible landmarks. That shining thing in the moonlight must be the river marked on my map. They would reach the target area and drop their bombs as accurately as they could.
Its greatest advantage was its slow speed. Anti-aircraft batteries were designed to engage fast-moving aircraft, making the Po-2 much harder to hit. The Polikarpov Po-2 was extremely versatile. It served as a trainer, a light bomber, and much more. The fuselage could be opened up, allowing 2 stretchers to be loaded inside. It was frequently used to evacuate wounded soldiers from the front lines to hospitals.
One day they were summoned and told they had been assigned a secret mission, but no details were provided. My father was commanding the squadron. Their task was to escort 2 civilian aircraft to Tehran.
They received a clear order. Any aircraft that approaches either of these twin-engine planes is to be shot down immediately. At one point, a young pilot performed an aerobatic maneuver and began approaching the formation. Bravo recognized him and thought, he's fooling around again. Just another reckless stunt. After landing, a colonel summoned Bravo and said, "You failed to carry out your orders. You should have shot him down immediately." Bravo replied, "Please, sir, he's just a young pilot. Forgive him."
They lined up on the runway after landing and finally learned whom they had been escorting. It was Stalin.
Stalin approached him and asked, Are you Georgian?" Bravo was short, dark-haired, and had a somewhat Caucasian appearance. "No," he replied, "I'm Spanish."
When Stalin died in 1953, things gradually began to relax, and amnesties started to be granted. They were transported to the port of Odessa in cattle trains. He always remembered seeing a flag with stripes and saying, overcome with emotion, "The Americans, the Americans."
Vale, venga, voy.
But it wasn't the Americans. It was a Greek ship, the Semiramis, sailing under a Liberian flag. They arrived in Barcelona on April 2nd, 1954. It wasn't that the Republicans came back accompanying more than 200 former Blue Division prisoners. It was actually the other way around.
The Blue Division veterans received a spectacular welcome. The Republicans, on the other hand, were quietly taken through the back door and sent straight to interrogations, first by the Spanish authorities, and then, of course, by the CIA, who were also very interested. Where have you been? What was there? What were the factories like? Who was in charge? The same questions over and over again. And when it came time to rebuild their lives, they had a very hard time and relied heavily on one another for support.
We returned home, saddened, because we had lost a battle. But later, we realized it had only been a battle. The reality is that today we have won the war, because freedom and democracy prevail, and I believe we played a small part in making that happen. It was worth it.
When they returned, they were nobody. They held the rank of pilot sergeant, but those qualifications had been earned in the Soviet Union. In 1954, Spain and the Soviet Union had no diplomatic relations, so what they had learned meant nothing officially. They were not recognized until the 1980s.
Spain has only ever made one true hero, Dolores Ibarruri's son. The rest of us were never honored. Decorations? Yes, I have many. I have 16 Soviet medals.
Потому что мы пилоты, небо наш родимый дом. Первым делом в самолете, а девушки потом.
My name is Mercedes Caldevilla Martinez. I am the daughter of Juan Caldevilla.
He was a navigator gunner, but an extremely important one. He trained the observers and navigators required by the Katiuskas operating in Spain. Initially, all of them were Russians. The first unit consisted of 30 Soviet aircraft, and their pilots knew virtually nothing about Spanish geography. Men like Juan Caldevilla taught the Russian navigators how to navigate over Spain.
When my father left for Kirovabad, he held the rank of captain. At first, the only qualification recognized was that of maestre, a naval aviation rank roughly equivalent to sergeant. Several of them joined together and fought for recognition. But it was a long struggle.
And what did your father eventually achieve?
The rank of colonel, yes, and he also received back pay and financial compensation. But above all, he received recognition.
Memory must be humanized, and memory is humanized through life stories and through explicit recognition of those individuals and their families.
Our school continues to honor its connection with the Spanish pilots. Their achievements during the Spanish Civil War and the Second World War, as well as their successful air operations against Nazi Germany, are presented to our students through our exhibitions.
Those who died during training were buried in Ganja's Alley of Honor.
Manuel González, Bautista Juan, Francisco Fernández. "44 volunteers joined the Second World War. Those who lost their lives were buried in Baku.
Those battle-hardened young men were true heroes of the Republican Air Force. There was Zaroza, who probably shot down between 20 and 24 enemy aircraft during the war. José María Bravo was just 19 when he became a fighter pilot, and only 21 when the war came to an end. Andrés Fierro shot down 2 German aircraft. The Spanish pilot with the highest number of aerial victories over Russia during the Second World War was Juan Lario. Then there was Lacalle, the famous Lacalle, and Aguirre. They were exceptionally capable men. They had learned the hard way through experience and necessity. They had no choice but to master their profession under the harshest of circumstances.
As one of them once said, the best years of our youth were lost in this war. Wars always, always, always depend on the young. Sadly, through something as tragic as war, they were given the opportunity to fulfill their dream of flying.